Thank you so much, Kim, for the great introduction. It's really fantastic to be back in Arizona and felt like coming home today and had the good fortune of seeing condors in Zion yesterday and condors at Grand Canyon today. So it's been a wonderful return. Thank you all for coming. I can't believe this group. It's so exciting to know that condors still garner a lot of enthusiasm and attention. I have to admit that, I'll tell you a little story, first of all, about before I came down to work with condors. A few days before I first came down here to take over as field manager for the program, I was in a bookstore up in Montana where I was living, and a new book had just come out on condors, and I thought I better buy it and learn everything I can about the species that I'm about to work with. My husband and I were standing in the aisle looking at this condor book. There's a big condor head on the cover of the book, and I was about to reach out and grab it. And two little girls came marching down the aisle, kind of right in front of us, and one of them stopped and put her hands on her hips and said, "California condors are the ugliest birds in the world," to her friend. And then they marched off. And I just sat there and wow, that took the kind of steam out of my enthusiasm. I've worked with eagles and hawks and all these neat songbirds, and am I ready to work with the ugliest bird in the world? Well, it took only a few days of working with condors before I became completely captivated by them. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll have a slightly better idea of what makes them so appealing to people. I served as the field manager, as Kim mentioned, for the Condor Reintroduction Program in Arizona for almost 4 years. So I'll talk about some of the challenges that we encountered during my, while reintroducing this very complex, highly endangered species. I'll also share some of the milestones that I was fortunate enough to experience during my time with this very dynamic long-term recovery program. And finally, I'll share some of the threats faced by condors. And this has particular relevance to all of us, since disappearing wildlife is often a wake-up call that there's something seriously wrong in our environment. This is Condor 210, some of you know her, in front of the Vermilion Cliffs, which is where the Arizona Reintroduction site is located. Oh, can somebody give me a little more light? Anyway, before delving into this talk, I thought I would talk a little bit about natural history. There are many of you at the Condor, the park here, that work here, live here, know everything about the condors, but hopefully there are also some visitors here as well that are less familiar with condors. So I thought I'd give you a little background on what exactly is a condor. Condors are basically a supersized vulture. They are one of only 2 species of condors in the world. There's the California condor, which is in North America, and the slightly larger Andean condor that lives in South America. California condors are part of the New World vulture family, basically vultures that live in North and South America. So they're related to our turkey vultures that live in North America and species like the king vulture that lives in Central and South America. I hear that it's difficult to go backwards. Hold on. Hold on, sorry. There's a back arrow. I know, they say it doesn't work.
The previous just pulled the trigger.
That's what I was trying to do. Sorry about this. Can anyone help me with that? Yeah, the back arrow doesn't work. Yeah, the mouse is California condors are the largest flying land bird in North America. They have a wingspan of up to 9.5 feet, and that's compared to bald eagles and golden eagles that have a wingspan of about 7 feet. Condors weigh about 16 to 24 pounds, and that's compared to bald eagles that weigh about, and golden eagles that weigh about 10 pounds. And a condor in flight, for those of you who haven't seen it, is truly a magnificent sight. But for those of you who haven't seen condors, it's difficult to conceive of how big they are, except that I just gave you a preview of the next slide. We know many of us are familiar with ravens, and so I wanted you to take a look at that slide and give you a little bit of perspective on how large condors are. Basically, the ravens are about the size of a condor's tail, so they're enormous birds. Condors are strictly scavengers. They have absolutely no equipment for killing anything. and they're visual scavengers. They use their exceptional eyesight to help them find their food, unlike turkey vultures, which have a well-developed sense of smell that they use to find food. Condors are very social, and they often feed together on carcasses. And they're opportunistic. They'll eat small animals like squirrels and rabbits if they find them, but typically they focus on much larger animals like deer and elk. This is the gory part of the show. Condors feeding on dead animals. This is some condors feeding on a young mule deer that fell to its death here at Grand Canyon. And here are two condors feeding on a mountain lion at the park. This lion was killed by a car, and the lion biologists dragged it into the woods and put some cameras on it to see if the condors would find it. And they did very, very quickly. I wanted to draw your attention to condors' feet, which are kind of interesting and not what people expect. They have big turkey-like feet. They're very different from the grasping feet and powerful talons of raptors or birds of prey. And they can't hold or pick up anything with those feet. They do have very powerful bills designed for tearing flesh, and their bill is probably their best defensive weapon. As part of an adaptation for feeding on dead animals, condors, like other vultures, have featherless heads and necks. Adults have these pinkish heads and reddish eyes, and there's no physical distinction between males and females, except that the males tend to be a little bit heavier. Condors take about 6 to 7 years to mature, and they don't attain their adult plumage and coloration until they're about 5 to 6 years old. This is Condor 119, when she was about 7 years old, and this bird was famous for several reasons. In 1998, when 119 was 3 years old and had been in the wild just over a year, she made a 600-mile round-trip journey from northern Arizona, the release site, up to Flaming Gorge, Wyoming. So she's the only bird that we know of that has traveled that far, the only bird we know of, reintroduced condor that we know of that has gone to Wyoming. In 2001, she became the first reintroduced condor to lay an egg in the wild. And it was the first egg laid in the wild in 15 years. And I happen to be the fortunate one who found the egg. So she's always had a very special place in my heart. Juvenile condors, meanwhile, have dark heads and brown eyes. Their heads are covered with a dark gray fuzz for their first 2 years of life. And all condors have this ruff of neck feathers that they can elevate to cover their head and neck. At around 3 years of age, condors start developing a pink ring around their necks. We call them ring necks at that stage. And the pink gradually spreads to the rest of their head. So we have a 2-year-old condor on the left and a 3-year-old condor on the right. By 6 years of age, condors attain their pretty spectacular adult head colors, and these colors become especially vibrant during the breeding season. This is Condor 123 when he was 7 years old, and for many, many years he was the dominant condor in our flock. Adult juvenile condors also look different in flight. They're pretty easy to distinguish. This is an adult condor, and they have these bright white triangles under the wing, very contrasting black and white wing. Whereas the juvenile condors have more of a smudgy gray undertone to their wings. Condors are said to be relics of the Pleistocene, and during that time period, over 10,000 years ago, they had a U-shaped range that went from southern British Columbia down to California into Baja, Mexico, across through Texas and Florida, and up into New York State. And it's believed that their range contracted with the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna. By the 1900s, condors were largely restricted to California, and this is the core of their range in Southern California up until the 1980s. Here's Los Angeles, and San Francisco's off the map to the north, just to give you some perspective. Scattered reports, though, also exist of condors occurring outside of California until the 1920s. Lewis and Clark shot several condors up in the Columbia River drainage in Oregon and Washington in the early 1800s. Condors also occurred in the Grand Canyon region. They appear to have been fairly abundant in this area during the Pleistocene. Many of the caves that have been explored in the Grand Canyon contain fossilized condor bones. Condors also occurred in Arizona in historic times. 2 condors were sighted, and one, unfortunately, was subsequently shot on the western edge of what is today Grand Canyon National Park. And the last sighting of a condor in Arizona was in 1924 near Williams, Arizona, which is just south of the Grand Canyon.